Welcome to another broadcast of Majoring in the Majors on the Artist First Radio Network. All past broadcasts are podcasts. You can find them at artistfirst.com. Your host, Pastor S.J. Munson, is the author of two books, The Treasure of Israel and Christ Held Hostage, The Hijacking of Christianity. Find them wherever great books are sold. Now, here he is, your host, Pastor S.J. Munson.
Hi, this is S.J. Munson, and welcome to Majoring in the Majors. The recent election of an unabashed fascist and white supremacist convicted criminal to the most powerful office in the free world has political historians and constitutional scholars wringing their hands, for never, have we ever faced such a threat to our democracy, our Constitution, and the rule of law in one man and at one time. Or have we? And that's a good question to ask. And here to talk about that and review a bit of American history and perhaps inject some hope is Dr. Corey Brettschneider. He currently teaches political science and constitutional law at Brown University. He received his PhD from Princeton, I've heard of that, and his law degree from Stanford. He's the author of books such as The Oath and the Office, on impeachment, the Presidency on Trial, and most recently, the best-selling The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. His other writings have appeared in such publications as Time Magazine, Politico, and the New York Times. Welcome, Dr. Brettschneider, and thank you for making time for us.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
You've taught political science and constitutional law for most of your adult life, but beginning with the 2016 election, you felt compelled to speak out more publicly about where all this was going. Could you talk more about that, what that journey was like?
Well, it was based partly in the, exactly as you said, calling out Donald Trump for what he is, a walking threat to democracy. I wrote a piece called Trump versus the Constitution, and the subtitle was a guide for Politico, thinking that it was just so outrageous what he was saying after he came down that escalator, the threat to torture the families of suspected terrorists, the promise to shut down the libel laws, the complete disregard for the rule of law. And my thought in that piece was just to go through each of the proposals that he was making in that campaign and to talk about why it was a violation of the Constitution. But after he took power and began to reshape the court, things became a lot more complicated, especially with the nomination and confirmation of these 3 justices. He's really reshaped the Constitution in a kind of authoritarian image. So I thought that at this moment, and of course the book was written before he won re-election, but with the real possibility that he would come back, the idea was to try to write something more subtle about American history, because as much as I believe certainly that those statements are a threat to the Constitution, it's clearly a particular idea of the Constitution that I'm talking about, a democratic one. And part of what I show in the book is that there's long been an authoritarian idea of the Constitution, and that danger of the authoritarian idea is compounded when it's in the hands of authoritarian presidents. So I detail 5 before Trump authoritarian presidents and the threat that they pose to democracy. And as you know, the book isn't just about worry about authoritarianism. It's also a book about hope, because it's also about how the democratic idea of the Constitution has repeatedly been rescued, not by judges, but by citizens prevailing on what I call recovery presidents.
Now, you mentioned in your book several times and make it very clear that a lot of people, most Americans think of the Supreme Court as sort of the last stand of democracy. They're the ones that interpret the Constitution for us. But actually, in history, they've often been part of the problem, or they've sided with toxic presidencies. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. We're sort of taught in 7th grade civics that the protection of the Constitution is in the hands of the court. And I want to really show that that is not remotely the case, that really it has been citizens that have repeatedly rescued the Constitution from authoritarian presidents. And worse than that, the court has often, exactly as you said, made things worse. So let's start with the first example. John Adams doesn't just sign the Sedition Act, he uses it as a tool to shut down the opposition party, about 126 prosecutions of political opponents. And whereas the Supreme Court, it's the Sedition Act itself and Adams' use of it is so clearly a violation of the First Amendment, you would have thought the court would have stepped in. But in that example, and this is going to be true throughout American history, Samuel Chase, probably the most prominent sitting Supreme Court justice, actually lobbies for the Sedition Act, politically lobbies for it, and sits on one of the trials to make sure that Thomas Cooper, an editor who criticized Adams' policies, is convicted and can't even raise the issue of free speech despite his attempt to do so. So from the beginning, the court has really engaged in a shutdown of the democratic idea of the Constitution and championed a much more authoritarian idea. I talk about President Buchanan lobbying the court in the Dred Scott case to really decide the most evil case in history. The Dred Scott says that Black Americans have no rights nationally under the federal Constitution. And the examples continue. Woodrow Wilson is certainly not opposed in his nationalization of segregation by the Supreme Court. And even when the court, the counterexamples, what about U.S. versus Nixon, for instance, saying that Richard Nixon was subject to a criminal subpoena where he was an unnamed co-conspirator. In that case, the court made the right decision, but really left so much room. It never said that the president is not above the law. In fact, it left open the possibility, which we now have, of presidential immunity. So even when the court seems to be acting heroically, I want to say, not so fast.
Right. You talk about the Nixon crisis, which is one of 5 presidents that you talk about in the book. And you mentioned that it was really not resolved. And this is the one particular crisis that really did not have a resolution. The showdown was basically preempted by his resignation. So we're still kind of dealing with the thought of imperial presidency today. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, that's exactly well put. The structure of the book is, so if the court's not saving us, what do I mean by the idea that the people are saving us? And I want to give a really, precise concept and examples of how this has happened. It's not just that the people are opposing authoritarianism. They do. Citizens do that repeatedly. Heroes like Thomas Cooper, who I mentioned, or in the second instance, really the hero of the book, if I had to choose one, is Frederick Douglass, who opposes Buchanan. But what these heroes do is they don't just speak out, they prevail on subsequent presidents to put the Constitution back in order. Now, what about the Nixon crisis? There were attempts after Watergate to fix things. The independent counsel law, for instance, during President Carter's presidency is very important. President Carter, who just passed, of course. But it didn't succeed. There was a recovery from the Sedition Act. There was a recovery from Dred Scott, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments make that clear. There was a recovery from Wilson's nationalization of white supremacy, the crisis I talk about in the third section of the book. Took a long period of time, but the NAACP and other activists succeeded in getting legislation like the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But the last crisis of the book is about the Nixon presidency, and I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg at length for the book, and I talk about how so many of Nixon's crimes, well beyond Watergate, which was kind of a minor crime when you look at the vast numbers, they were so vast. And why do we not know about it? Why do we not know about, for instance, the attempt to break into and blow up, really, the Brookings Institution in order to get materials that Nixon believed was in a safe in that think tank, materials that Ellsberg had procured to show his complicity in making a deal with the Viet Cong to prolong the war. Why do we not know about the attempt on Ellsberg's life on the Capitol steps? And the answer is because of the pardon. The pardon really hid so much of Nixon's criminality, and it really led, I think, in many ways to the system that we began with in the Nixon administration, which we temporarily got rid of but are now back to, where the person who's supposed to be prosecuting the president if the president commits a crime actually works for the president, the circumstance that led to the Saturday Night Massacre. So we not only have failed to recover, but things are made so much worse now by the Supreme Court's decision in Trump versus the United States, which says that really a president is above the law, that at least in a president's official duties, there's a presumption of immunity. It's the official duties that where a president is most dangerous, and immunity meaning not only really can't be prosecuted is the meaning of it.
Now, you a big theme in the book is these basic freedoms that we have in our democracy. That American democracy, you say, is more than just the right to vote. There are three actual pillars of our democracy, and each pillar is fundamental to what we think of as America, but also very, very fragile. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. Exactly. Thanks again for reading this book so closely. Part of the book is a history, but it's also meant to be a celebration of a constitutional idea that embraces the notion of self-government. The Constitution obviously begins with we the people, but we forget how often interpretations of the Constitution stray from that democratic idea. And I want to be specific about what I mean where the democracy in this idea is. It's partly in that citizens are taking the meaning of the law into their own hands, reclaiming it from authoritarian presidents, but it's also that they reclaim it in particular in the name of particular values. And I really call out three that I focus on in the book. And one is, as you say, the right not just of free speech. Even authoritarian presidents have recognized a limited idea of free speech, but a right to dissent, to criticize the president, the leader, even John Adams, something that he, with his much more authoritarian, really monarchical idea of the Constitution, that's how he thought of the president as a kind of king and thought, yes, free speech, but not the right to criticize me. And the democratic idea of dissent stands in opposition to that. The second idea, of course, doesn't exist in the 18th century. It's really a 19th century idea, and we owe it to the incredible life and work of Frederick Douglass. And that's the idea of not just equality in some general sense or equal protection, a phrase that Douglass was a fan of, but the idea of equal citizenship. And that's a long-thought idea against Dred Scott, which says Black Americans aren't only lack any rights, aren't even legal persons. Douglass is always championing the idea of a kind of political equality, equal citizenship. And the right to vote is certainly part of that, but it's not the only part of it. It also includes rights against second-class citizenship, against American apartheid, against the 20th century practice, of course, 19th century practice of segregation even after slavery. And the third ideal of democracy, which is particularly salient at this moment, is the notion of a rule of law. That we are a nation of not led by men is the famous phrase, but a nation of laws in particular, in which no person is above the law, not even a president. Now, that case that I mentioned, U.S. versus Nixon, is often cited for that proposition that no person is above the law, but I've argued that it really didn't go far enough. It didn't actually say that, and part of what I'm arguing in that last section is that the ability to prosecute and investigate a president, and even imprison a president who commits wrongdoing, that should be part of the democratic idea of the Constitution, one that we've fallen very far away from.
For those of you who just tuned in, we're talking to Dr. Corey Brettschneider, who is a professor of political science and a constitutional scholar, and the author of The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defeat It. Your book also talks about constitutional crises and what happened next are not part of some self-correcting mechanism that's built into the Constitution, that the corrections catalyzed were often catalyzed by just ordinary citizens. And you call these democratic constitutional constituencies, that were sort of a check on presidential power, not just from the Constitution or Supreme Court, but from actual just average people. Could you talk more about that?
Sure. There's a long tradition, of course, of talking about democratic protest and social movements. But what I really wanted to do in the book is to narrow in on a particular idea and kind of democratic action that, again, isn't just, laudable, but that worked. And what I show in the book is that what was incredible about these 4 moments of recovery, and the 5th, of course, is something that's needed now, is that they centered around not just citizen action, but citizen action galvanized around recovering a particular idea of the Constitution, one of those core pillars. And the heroes of those movements really were leaders in those movements, articulated an idea of the Constitution that had been threatened by authoritarian presidents. And so this isn't just an abstract, theory of democracy. It's something that happens. So there really isn't a widespread understanding of the right to dissent until those editors that I talked about, as they were facing prosecution from Adams, they actually used their own trials as a way to demonstrate the importance of a democratic idea to not only to free speech, but to criticize the president. We take it for granted, for instance, that part of free speech is Saturday Night Live's ability to criticize Trump or Biden or Ford. That's what we see every week on television in the United States. But that isn't an idea that's solidified in any way in the 18th century. It's one that's championed by the editors. And when Jefferson is elected at their behest, they really use the election of 1800 as a kind of referendum on the right to dissent. And he issues that famous line, "We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans." He's really saying, I'm not going to shut down, as Adams did, the opposition party. It's the moment in which that idea becomes really spread and solidified in the consciousness of Americans as not just a right to free speech, but a right to dissent. And that isn't the idea in England. In England, sedition is a crime. You can't criticize the king. But the editors really go far to make that idea a reality of not just a right to free speech, but a right to even criticize the leaders, where the president is not above the law and so can be subject to criticism. That isn't just a, by the way, part of democracy. To me, it is a central pillar, as I call it. So these editors really do the work. And in the second cluster, Frederick Douglass does a similar thing with a different issue. In the face of a decision that says that, and a president, that Black Americans are not people under the Constitution, he champions this very different idea. And how does he prevail? He really, when Lincoln is elected in 1860, Douglass is very skeptical that the two of them can be allies. And, Lincoln, for instance, just to give listeners an idea of where he was in 1860, he has this idea that the president really needs to follow the letter of the law, and that means Dred Scott, even though he disagreed with it, is the letter of the law, and he says he's going to enforce it, albeit narrowly. The Fugitive Slave Act, he says, is the law, and he's going to enforce it. And Douglass is saying, no, there's a very different idea of a constitutional right of equal citizenship that slavery itself violates. And he says, for instance, the preamble of "we the people" doesn't say "we the white people." It is a guarantee for all. He talks about the ban on the corruption of blood, inheriting the crimes of parents. And what is that but a ban on slavery, he says. And he uses those kinds of techniques. Most importantly, he turns to the Declaration, and its declaration of all men being equal, which he understands to mean all people. And those principles, he say, couldn't be more at odds with Buchanan and Lincoln, even in the beginning of his presidency. And miraculously, it is a kind of miracle, I think, that in these meetings with Lincoln begins to change his mind, to really move from this rigid idea of legality to seeing that the moral principle of equality is core to the Constitution. And, the most dramatic moment, I think, in the Lincoln presidency, of course, is Gettysburg. And when he talks about the Declaration being the founding of America, when he talks about a government by, for, and of the people, he's really finally channeling Douglas. He never mentions slavery in that speech, but he's certainly referencing it. And the same is true, I think, of his last speech before he dies with his assassin in the audience. He talks about a right to vote for black soldiers, an idea that Douglas had long championed. Douglas says in the end that Lincoln was still a white man's president, but he's come so close to his view. It's really the Grant presidency that embraces Douglas's idea. So I gave you two examples from the first half of the book of how these citizens, it's not just that they fight back, it's that they prevail in a deep way.
Certainly one of the things that impresses me most about Abraham Lincoln is that he does listen, and he changes, he grows, not just as a president, but as a human being, and you can kind of track him in his growth. Certainly with his dealing with his conversations with Frederick Douglass and other things that happened during his presidency. But impressive, it doesn't always happen with presidents.
Right. Yeah, you need a particular kind of person. And, they're not just an empty vessel. The president has to have a kind of set of values and character that leaves them open to these transformations. I mean, the other huge one, unexpected one, is Harry Truman, who's really chosen by FDR to satisfy Southern Democrats who are worried about his previous vice president, Wallace, being too liberal on civil rights. And Truman's the last person you think is going to be a civil rights hero. But when he hears Walter White tell the story of black soldiers returning from the war and being beaten, in one case on a bus, returning from a base, he really is moved. And there's something in his character that's open to this moment. And I don't think it's intellectual in Truman's case. It's more emotional. But the NAACP is really ready with a vision of equal citizenship to lay out that Truman eventually endorses. That doesn't come easily. I talked about this unknown hero, Sadie Alexander, who really makes that happen. But as you say, the presidents the recovery presidents here get credit too. Madison, the champion of free speech; Grant, the prosecution of more than 1,000 white terrorists throughout the United States at Douglas's behest, and Truman in that third period. They really are these, I would say, kind of heroic figures because of their transformations.
I don't want to reveal all of the different episodes because I want people to read the book, but I was very interested in, as a Princetonian, of course, Woodrow Wilson. He's often credited being one of our best presidents, world leader, peacemaker, but he was also at home, at least, a rabid racist and white supremacist. Could you talk a little bit about him and how people fought against what he did?
Yes, and Princeton is a big part of this story. I took seminars when I was a graduate student in the library that all this time was housing these incredible notebooks that one of the librarians collected after Wilson left Princeton. He realized this was a world historical figure, and it was somebody who was, not just university president, but a longtime professor at Princeton, lecturer. So what the notebooks reveal, and I think I'm the first, I keep saying this hoping that somebody might challenge me on it, but I think it turns out to be true. I haven't seen anybody else talk about them or look at them, but what I did was go into the library and get this box of these old, some of them leather-bound notebooks of the students writing down what Wilson was saying in those lectures. And really what you see, and not just from the notebooks, but from other sources as well, his textbook, his lectures that he was giving on other campuses, is a devotion to an idea of the Constitution, not just as authoritarian, but as a kind of, as he's not the first white supremacist president, but he's certainly the first white nationalist president. And for Wilson, the presidency is, first of all, a first among equals, and he's really an admirer of Bismarck and the kind of German national system. And he thinks in particular what Germany helps him to see is that what a president's charged with is national efficiency. So what is the opposite of national efficiency? It's a word that he uses throughout his presidency and in his teaching called friction. And friction is essentially integration. And so it's essential to his idea of the Constitution that integration be opposed and that segregation segregation. The problem with it, as William Monroe Trotter, the person who challenges him on this point, points out, is that it sounds like benign separation, and really it's apartheid that is the philosophy here, second-class citizenship. And so William Monroe Trotter is a newspaper editor and activist from Boston, and with Ida B. Wells, they confront Wilson in the White House when he's essentially resegregating the federal government. He doesn't do it publicly; he's doing it quietly, and they battle it out. And Wilson essentially says that they're creating friction; that all he's trying to do is reduce friction, create separation of the races. And Trotter says back, and we know this because Trotter leaked the transcript. No, Mr. President, you're creating a system of second-class citizenship. And Wilson incredibly channels Plessy versus Ferguson in response. He says, if you see second-class citizenship here, it's in your mind essentially, and you're imposing it on the system. And it's just such an incredible moment because you see how deeply ingrained not just white supremacy is, but as Wilson is nationalizing the federal government, increasing its power, he's really trying to spread it. And there are a lot of other examples of his white supremacy too.
Two other points that you make about our constitutional system is one is that you say that the presidential systems compared to parliamentary systems tend to be more brittle historically, and twice as likely to fail. And also that these crises that you talk about are really the result of this tension or tug of war in our Constitution itself, which creates a powerful chief executive in the first place, whose power then also rests on the will of the people. Could you unpack some of that?
Yes. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you just repeat that question?
Sure. Yeah, I was making drawing two points from your book. One is that presidential systems tend to be more brittle than parliamentary systems and twice as likely to fail, which is interesting from a historical standpoint. And also that these crises that you talk about are the result of a tension within the Constitution itself, which create a powerful chief executive whose power then also rests on the will of the people.
Great, thanks. And thanks for really diving into the complexities of the argument here. There's a famous political scientist named Juan Lentz who really created that thesis that I think, as we look into it, we see is more and more true, that presidential systems are, as you put it exactly, they're brittle. Now, why are they brittle? One reason is the president is in power for 4 years, as opposed to in a parliament where you can have no confidence votes, for instance, and the country can move if a president creates crises of the kinds that I'm talking about and want to resist. It's just easier to do so. So it's partly that, but it also is just the massive power of the presidency. And although it is true, I think, that presidential power is aggrandized over time, it is, I think, from the beginning, and I'm different here than some historians and political scientists. I really think it is a powerful office from the beginning because it has that prosecutorial function that you see during the Adams administration. And those two things really make it dangerous. And so it's baked into the system. This isn't just an accident that you see these cycles of crises and then recovery. It's baked into the system that the presidency is a danger. But it also is the thing in my telling that allows for recovery, because the power of the presidency, at the same time that it can be used to destroy democracy, it also can be used to repair it.
Now, you talk about the presidents who created the crises and then also key individuals, some of them well-known, some of them perhaps, we would not have heard of. I think I know the answer to this, but who is your favorite of all these citizens who reacted to these crises?
Thanks for asking that. It's hard to choose because they are each so heroic in their own moment. But if I had to choose one, and the reason for this is because I think he is the true founder of American democracy, and he's not an 18th century founder; he's a 19th century founder. but he teaches us how to read the 18th century founding documents, and that's Frederick Douglass. He really is. I mean, the editors, are defending a right to dissent, but they're certainly not defending the full rights of equality that Douglass teaches us about. And he not only teaches us about it, he taught the person that's usually regarded as the best president about it, Abraham Lincoln. And so I just think he is such an incredible figure from American history, and we should give him the title of the true founder of American democracy. And certainly not any 18th century founder that deserves that title.
I was wondering if you could indulge me in a moment of my playing devil's advocate, because I can just imagine someone who's kind of burned out right now saying, yeah, that's all well and fine, but Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and even Martin Luther King Jr. didn't have to contend with Fox News and the lie machine that spews forth mind-numbing propaganda 24/7, the power of indoctrination into a cult of personality, which we've never seen before on this level, and one backed by unending cash from billionaire oligarchs. The Citizens United opinion, of course, opened up a Pandora's box of opportunities for the domination of obscene wealth in our democratic processes. And so it's not enough really to merely present a constitutional case. We need some massive deprogramming scheme on a national level to re-win the minds of half of America, millions and millions of people. And then we still have to put the genie of billionaire cash back into the bottle. How, I know it's a difficult question, but I don't want to put you on the spot. How would you react to that?
I want to embrace it. And I'll say, before, of course, I'm going to go on to talk about why we should still have hope. That's the point of the book. And I think when we dive into the examples, we can see why. But I do want to say that there's nothing in the book that promises recovery. It's not that because this happened before, it's guaranteed to happen again. And sometimes political scientists have this mechanistic way of arguing, and I do not. I really think that it should happen. It can happen, which I think is extremely important. It ought to happen. It can happen. Is it guaranteed to happen? No, that really is up to us and whether or not we're willing to make it happen. But that said, that part of agreeing with what you're saying for all the reasons that you brought up and the challenges, I think when you look back in the moment of what these crises were like, they seemed insurmountable, certainly as insurmountable as things seem now, if not more. And let me just take you back into each of these moments that we've been talking about. In 1798, these editors are facing prosecution, and although they're saying we have a right to criticize Adams, that's far from an established idea. It isn't the case, as is now, that you can kind of reach into the ether of American politics and see that, of course, Saturday Night Live is constitutionally protected. They really are, as much as they're saying we're recovering a democratic idea of we the people, of free speech, and there is a First Amendment that's been passed, it's far from clear what its meaning is. So they really have to create it almost out of thin air. Adams also, if you want to really get into the parallels, his party, one of the editors is prosecuted for uncovering a plot to refuse to certify electoral votes in the 1800 election. They're going to create a committee that is going to use the delicacy of the Electoral College for a kind of coup on Adams' behalf. So all of the stuff that we've seen recently is there then, and it's even more pressing because, as I said, you don't have the establishment of the democratic idea of the right to dissent. We have their legacy to thank for that. Think of Frederick Douglass, who, those editors are prosecuted and convicted. Douglass has to flee the country. He is really being hounded by Buchanan and his allies. And so many of the speeches that he has to give about American democracy, the ones that found American democracy, are given from abroad. And, the idea that the founder of American democracy can't even be in America, as bad as things are, we're not at that point. We mentioned Trotter, and there's a tragic part of Trotter's life, which is he winds up killing himself, convinced that Wilson's legacy and not his will be the future of American democracy. That's how despondent he is. So in these moments, it just looked horrible. it looked as much as now like there's no way that we're going to recover. And what did these citizens do? They reclaimed the democratic idea of the Constitution. They overcame court cases, structural deficits, to refound America. And that's what we need to do now. There's nothing about the Citizens United case that's consistent with the notion of free speech. The right to free speech means the right to dissent. It doesn't mean the right of oligarchs to spend untold amounts of money, as Musk did, to elect a president and to become essentially a co-president. We could have an amendment to make that clear. We can have legislation that makes that clear. We can, as increasingly, I think, have court reform to replace the dynamics that allowed this case to be decided in the first place. We need to do that. You mentioned fragmentation of the media and the kind of, partisan division. On that, I think I'm even on stronger ground in looking to the past because, it was extremely partisan when it came not just to opinions, but to facts, the way things were seen in the opposition to Adams leading up to the 1800 election. Some of the country was with the editors, some were on behalf of this authoritarian idea of the Constitution, and that's true too in Douglas's time. These periodicals also, you have more listeners to this show than the editors did of their periodicals, or that Douglas, I looked at Douglas's numbers of the circulation of Frederick Douglass's paper and the North Star. Those were the names of his publications, and it's really in the thousands. So, despite that fragmentation, the idea is able to catch on. So, if they succeeded, we could succeed. That's the bottom line. And it isn't the case that things are so much worse now. I mean, you mentioned the cult of personality. I think that is a particular kind of danger. We didn't have presidents coming back a second time. That's another. In all these other instances, they disappeared. So there are definitely challenges of the moment that are unique. But we recovered before, and I do have hope that we can do it again.
One last question. What advice would you give to Americans right now at this moment in our history? As a political and constitutional scholar, what would you tell us? What do we need to do? What do we need to hope for? What do we need to think?
There's I think, tendency, and this book, I think, speaks to this debate at this moment that really parallels the one that was facing the country after the Dred Scott case, and that's whether or not to abandon the Constitution and whether or not to couch democratic reform consistent with the ideals of the Constitution, or to say this whole thing is terrible, let's get rid of it. And Lloyd Garrison, the opponent of Frederick Douglass, saw things very differently from Frederick Douglass. He said, look, Dred Scott was essentially evil and correct when it came to the meaning of the Constitution, because the Constitution was bad from the beginning. And, I'm glad that view didn't prevail. That isn't the view that worked. It was the Douglass way of thinking. So I think that as we start to think about recovery of democracy, recovering the democratic Constitution should be our focus. And that's certainly very different from the way that many activists are seeing things today.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Corey Brettschneider, for your spending time with us and talking about your book, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It. It is full of hope. It is full of hope when we realize that we're not the first ones to face this. And it will obviously take courage and maybe a long time. But it is hope is certainly a possibility. And your book is available on Amazon and wherever good books are sold.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to speak with you. I really appreciate you reading the book so closely. Thanks so much.
Well, it's a great topic, and thank you so much for your thorough research into American history and being able to speak publicly out about this as a scholar.
Thank you. Pleasure.
And for those of you tuned in, thank you very much for tuning in to Majoring in the Majors, and have a great week.